And for more on these sanctions, last hour I spoke with Daniel McAdams, director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. I started out by asking him why new evidence surfacing in regards to information from the DNC being leaked, not hacked, wasn't being considered when it came to allegations against Russia meddling in the U.S. election.
I think that's certainly what some are suggesting. I don't think we have the final answer as to what happened, and I don't think many people in Washington are that awfully interested in what actually happened with the leak or the hack or whatever it was. They've established as a fact on the ground that Russia hacked our elections, and so therefore nobody needs to question anymore. However, if you look at the intelligence community's report on it, it's certainly not conclusive, and it's not an entire product of the entire intelligence community.
I see. And okay, now turning to your article, the title alone says that these sanctions, quote, pumps adrenaline into Cold War. Who voted for these sanctions thinks there's truth to that?
Well, I think probably a lot of the people in Congress who voted for these sanctions don't know much about it and haven't read the bill. The bills aren't often read in Congress. But, you know, people in Congress, once again, are not very well informed. Members of Congress read the Washington Post, the mainstream media, the New York Times, and so they're only getting one side of the story. And that side of the story is that Russia hacked the elections, they're undermining our democracy, and therefore, if we don't act immediately, something terrible will happen. So, no, there's not a lot of thought that goes into it, and there's the mistaken idea that sanctions are a harmless way of making the world do what the U.S. wants it to do. Unfortunately, sanctions often do lead to war, and I think that's where this is heading.
Now, you brought up Section 231 of this legislation imposing sanctions on, quote, persons who are, quote, engaging with transactions with Russian intelligence. So tell us how you think this could impact those of us at RT, and is this uncalled for?
Yeah, this is something that stood out to me when I read the bill, and it's one of those bills that's very difficult to read. They love doing this where they have a lot of curlicues, but that really jumped out to me because the CIA Director Pompeo and others in the national security community in the United States have made great efforts to suggest that RT and other Russian government-funded media is an arm of the military or intelligence services. So if you look at that language in a certain way, it suggests that those who are, quote, having transactions, does that mean appearing on RT? We don't know. It's vague language, but they're subject to sanctions, to 5 different sanctions by the U.S. government. I think this is the beginning of the kernel of a crackdown on RT and other Russian government-funded publications and broadcasts.
Very interesting. Well, we sure hope not. And in response to these sanctions, Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for, some 700 U.S. diplomats to leave Russia by September 1st. And a State Department official told the Associated Press that it was a regrettable and uncalled for act. And what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first, it's hilarious that CNN headline, Putin guts U.S. embassy in Moscow, when in fact I was surprised to realize there were that many U.S. government employees working at the embassy in Moscow, 1,200 people. So the only thing that President Putin has done is he's pared it down to have parity with how many Russians are operating in Washington, D.C. And it's a move that obviously he's taken reluctantly. He didn't do it right away. This was Obama's parting shot as he left office. And I think President Putin gave Trump plenty of opportunity to make good on his campaign promises of getting along better with Russia. And instead of doing that, what has the president done? He's hired a bunch of neocons, Russophobic neocons who are dead set in favor of starting Cold War 2.0. And I think the sanctions were the last straw for the Russians. They had to do something to retaliate.
And some are saying that these sanctions violate international law, and there's talk of officials in Brussels considering countermeasures. Do you think the U.S. is worried about its relationship with the rest of Europe at this point?
Well, I think the people in Washington are infected by hubris. They don't believe that Europe will ever dare do anything against Washington. The Germans have said that it's illegal, that these sanctions are illegal. They certainly will hurt German companies that are trying to do business with Russia. The U.S. is forcing other countries to enforce its own laws, as if somehow we make the laws for the world. Will the Europeans break with the U.S. on this? I don't know how far they're willing to go. However, this is another straw on the camel's back, the proverbial camel's back, We'll see if that back breaks.
And now President Trump has not signed these sanctions into law, but Vice President Pence has come out and said it's likely a done deal. Do you think President Trump at this point will still try to negotiate a better deal since, as you mentioned in your article, that his hands are pretty much tied in this bill and has to get permission from Congress to alleviate these sanctions?
Well, at this point, there's nothing he could do. When I had written that, I didn't realize how overwhelming the vote would be in favor of these sanctions. So even a veto, he's sort of damned if he doesn't, damned if he doesn't. If he signs it, then forget his Russia policy as a candidate. If he doesn't sign it, it becomes law. It shows him as a completely weak president. What I would do if I were President Trump in such a box is I would not sign it. I would allow it to become law, and I would say that I would refuse to recognize it because I think it clips the president's wings, his constitutional authority to conduct foreign policy.